of Capitalism at Wake Forest University. Thank you for joining us today for the second of a series of panels on the implications of capitalism, on the implications of the pandemic and economic crisis for the future of capitalism. If you'd like to learn more about this series, please go to capitalism.wfu.edu to find more information, and you'll also find links to join our social media community. Today's topic is, will COVID-19 bring creation or destruction to campus? An educated citizenry is critical for a society rooted in democratic capitalism. Overall, college enrollment has increased over the last decade from about 35% of 18 to 24-year-olds to about 41%, and nationally over 40% of people under 45 have at least an associate degree. As a society, we want to continue to propel these statistics forward. COVID-19, however, has upended traditional learning and economic models for higher ed. And we're faced with complex risks and trade-offs around how to manage in-person and digital communities. So joining me today to discuss these issues are 5 distinguished panelists. First is Peggy Daley, who is the Managing Director of the Berkeley Research Group. Hi, Peggy.
Hi, how are you doing?
Next, we have Rogan Kersh, who's a provost and professor of political science at Wake Forest University. Welcome, Rogan.
Greetings. Thanks for having me, Christina.
Neal McCluskey is director of Cato Institute's Center for Educational Freedom. Hi, Neal.
Hi. Thanks for having me.
Thanks. And Robert Shibley is the executive director of the Foundation for Individual Rights and Education. Welcome, Robert.
Good to be here. Thank you.
So let me just briefly set up our discussion and then we'll get right into it. For any college that isn't completely online already, reopening campus is important for financial and community reasons. But this raises civil rights and liability issues for institutions. So civil rights issues can stem from things like tracing and tracking people and thinking about movement and speech. And privacy and security issues, of course, can stem from data collection and learning and surveillance related questions. Now, colleges, of course, have already been struggling with a lot of these questions, but the current environment we're in is requiring some decision-making under difficult circumstances. So, Neal, let me ask you to start off the conversation. You've done extensive research on higher education, and before this crisis hit, you already argued that we needed more robust competition in higher ed. But how does the existing relationship between the federal government and higher ed dictate the kinds of decisions that public and private schools can make in these circumstances? And maybe what are some things that might need to change?
Sure. So I think what a lot of people probably first need to understand is that you have public colleges and you have private colleges. Wake Forest is a private college. University of North Carolina is a public college. Public colleges usually have some sort of public governance. Private colleges don't. But for one reason in particular, there's often not a huge distinction between the governance of a private college and the governance of a public college. And that major factor is any school that accepts students that have federal student aid, so you think about Pell Grant, various loans, so that sort of program is subject to a whole lot of federal regulation. And also important to understand is some of that regulation is direct. A lot of it goes through accreditation, where if you want to be eligible to take those students who have that aid, you also have to get accredited. And the federal government essentially puts a stamp of approval on accreditors and puts a lot of requirements on accreditors. So the public-private distinction matters. I think we're going to discuss free speech issues and things like that. That in those cases, these distinctions become more important. But for a lot of rules and regulations, they come from accepting aid. And the reality is almost no college does not accept aid. There are, I think, 3 or 4 that totally turn it down, but otherwise almost everybody uses it because almost every college needs it to sort of stay competitive. And that means that a lot of rules apply no matter whether you're public or private, and some rules are going to apply regardless. Some of the things that colleges need to think about, although many, including Wake Forest, are already doing this, but many other colleges may not be, there are rules that are pretty recent, actually as of the end of 2019, about if you provide distance education, do you have to be approved by every state you have students in? And a lot of schools that were not mainly distance education before have been kind of forced into it. Schools need to think about how they're working that. There are different sort of state agreements that you could be part of to make that possible, but that's something that needs to be thought about by schools. How you serve students with disabilities. There are lots of requirements, especially for online content that you have to make sure you're following. And so schools of all type have to worry about that. And then you get into a lot of questions that I don't know that have been resolved. Well, we have lawyers here who can probably tell you way better than I can, but things like contact tracing, what are the implications of tracking who has, what ailment, how are you doing that tracing? So a lot of things that schools have to think about, many of them connected to federal rules and regulations that come through student aid that apply to everyone.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Neal. And Rogan, let me just jump to you. How do you see the particular situation at Wake Forest in terms of some of the conditions or considerations that Wake Forest has in regards to thinking about its relationship with these federal rules and regulations?
I guess one big area that's much on our minds right now, Christina, across higher ed, I know, is can we bring students back to campus with a degree of significant safety, public health considerations under social distancing this fall? And we really need from state and I would argue federal government clear enforceable standards and some kind of guidance of what's expected of us. The argument has turned, and this is so kind of American, isn't it, on whether there'll be liability waivers or not. But we're operating in an environment where, of course, protection from lawsuits is at least the edge of our thinking. We're much more concerned with what kind of thoughtful, reasonable guidance are we going to get to determine whether it's safe to bring students back. We, of course, are making our own determinants. We're doing a lot of work in conjunction with state health authorities and the CDC, but no, the fact that the federal debate mostly seems to be turning on what lawsuit protection looks like is a little discouraging. It'd be great to have some thoughtful public health-based standards and guidance in this particular vital area.
Mm-hmm. Peggy, Neal, you want to comment on that?
Neal, go ahead.
Oh, well, if you had something, I think Rogan is right that the big discussion in DC has been about liability protection, and clearly that is not the biggest issue. And I think people testified to that effect in the Senate last week of, this is, clearly something we're worried about, but that is not the big issue. Although there's also in DC, and it looks like the Senate, they had hearings with Mitch Daniels at Purdue and some others who are talking about, look, we're just going to move ahead regardless of what you're saying. So at Purdue, they bought, 100 miles of plexiglass or something they were talking about so they could put it between students. So a lot of schools are moving ahead regardless of what the federal government does.
Well, and I think they have to, don't you? I do think that the litigation issue is going to rear its head, and you have to put it into your thinking in that you want to make sure you're not being negligent. If you don't have standards, then you have to place yourself in a position of reasonableness. And is what we're doing reasonable given the current guidance that is available? What are we doing? You want to be creating a paper trail to make sure and actually doing real, really protective type practices. But I think right now there are already hundreds of lawsuits, class action lawsuits that have been brought against universities for tuition reimbursement. Everyone had to pivot. They had to pivot quickly. The overhead costs were already sunk in terms of that revenue that was coming in from the tuition for the semester that changed. And there are class action lawyers who are filing dozens and dozens of lawsuits against universities right now. If universities are not right now lobbying to get some sort of an immunity going forward, they should really rethink. They should think that. But there have to be protections for the students. I mean, the students look to the university to be the adult in the room and to put in particular safeguards, whether it's physical and health safeguards versus or cyber safeguards or what have you. So, you know, they have to be the protective, paternalistic force in that coming back, regardless of the fact that they have enormous amounts of money at stake. I mean, some schools, you know, their very existence is at stake, and I don't think students are going to want to come back. Let alone the whole issue of is it valuable for me to be online? You know, that's a whole nother issue. But they're not going to want to come back if they don't feel safe. So the very first thing you need to do as a university is to make sure that you, in fact, are creating a safe environment and are making it clear to the students that they're your first priority.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Rogan, you've been talking with a lot of peer institutions, and you know, I think thinking through what are the things we would ask students and parents to willingly opt into, so it is, you know, there is transparency and there are standards. So how are those conversations?
There's not consensus among the many peers that we're in regular conversation with, but there certainly is a kind of convergence around what we know is, of course, we will follow Centers for Disease Control guidance around staggering our schedules, aiming for smaller classes, enhancing air circulation systems, being sure that classrooms are sanitized, including between use, de-densifying, a verb I hadn't used before this crisis.
The new word for COVID-19,
de-densifying dining spaces and exercise and recreation spaces, dormitories themselves, requiring masks, very likely in all indoor spaces, including classrooms and dorm rooms, the usual requirements about hand washing. We also know that we'll be expanding online and blended style courses where part is face-to-face and part is taught remotely. Where Wake is, I think, I don't know if we're blazing a trail, but what we're working on hard now, and I've had some conversations with other schools that see this as valuable, is in terms of the behavior specifically, you point to, Christina, that parents and students more specifically have to opt into, issuing some kind of central administration edict about what we expect will get, you know, maybe some direction, maybe it'll make some parents feel better. But what we really need is a compact that students help develop. And that's where we're down the road on Awake, with many students from different professional and undergraduate backgrounds, belong to different organizations, a good wide representative swath. The head of new incoming student government president, Miles Middleton, is heading this effort. A student developed compact the students will sign on to. Here's what I acknowledge is the behavior expected, even required of me. I think that kind of student generated, obviously administrator, faculty, staff, curated compact is going to go a lot farther towards influencing behavior than our rules and regulations issued from on high.
Robert, would you have thoughts you want to share there?
Well, I think it's important to be careful about, a compact like that in terms of what it's going to require of students. And I certainly think, public universities are going to have less leeway than private universities are. Obviously, students are medical professionals. So, what they vote for, if you get it's ultimately a political, small p political consensus building exercise, you may end up with recommendations. My guess would be that they would be overly restrictive that people would vote for. And then you're going to have folks who are resistant to that for whatever reason. They might say, "Hey, I have the antibody test, for instance, and I'm, most likely immune, or, et cetera, et cetera. Also, just in terms of all of the standard kind of close contact that takes place on college campuses, particularly when it's, romantic or sexual in nature, that's going to be a very thorny issue for people to determine. I know that some of the public health authorities are already kind of broaching that with, how should people relate on dates, and should you even go on a date, and should there be some kind of barrier on a date, which seems like it wouldn't be much of a date, and even, New York got in the news arguing that you should maybe have sexual contact with a barrier between both of you, like a wall or something like that. So much of the college experience, because it is, young adults, is focused on, that kind of close contact. I don't want to say it's integral to college, but it's certainly a big part of the experience. I think there's going to be a lot of violations, regardless of what we ask of people, and there's going to have to be some way to temper the requirements with some mercy and understanding there. I think that the most effective will be, the actual, I guess, peer pressure is the word, of students being like, why aren't you, doing the hand sanitizer, things like that.
Behavioral norms, I think, are really important. I think not just on campus, but even in communities. I've noticed probably what we're seeing even with some COVID infections could ultimately be traced to communities and different behavioral norm standards. So it's very important. Yeah. Other thoughts, panelists?
Yeah, I would just say, sort of jumping on what Robert said, I think there's a real important but difficult line to draw of what is the institution's responsibility versus the students. So students will do lots of things in social situations. That's their own choice. And there's a good question of what's the university's role in this? I mean, this is all tied into much bigger debates we're having about lots of legal issues on campus. But I do think it's important that the institutions say, look, here are things that we are in charge of. Here are things that you all as adults have to make decisions for yourself, and don't blame us, the institution, if things don't go well based on your free choices.
Yeah, a lot of this is being placed over an already existing set of rules in the campus. So, you can have rules about alcohol and there's still binge drinking. There's still a party. The enforcement on that right now, some of those rules where you will have density of people, you may need to step that up. There are many schools that might take a blind eye at certain types of campus behavior that this coming fall, maybe that's not an appropriate way to behave, particularly when it's on campus property and they have an obligation potentially to make sure that their own rules are followed. They say from a legal perspective, when you write it down as a rule, you kind of have to live with it. You kind of have to enforce it, because it's far worse to have a rule that you don't enforce. So keeping that in mind is going to be very important, that layering of the different regulations. But you're right, if you're a highly at-risk student, if you've had a lung transplant, should you be going into the dorm? Should you, what are you going to be allowing? Are there going to be health restrictions that are placed on folks that are going into the dorms? If you're going to start the football team coming back in, are you going to require some kind of a health certification before they can show up for the homecoming game? Hard to say, but there's a lot, and it's really important for individuals to be responsible for their own behavior when they have the control and they have the most knowledge with regard to their own risk factors.
Christina rightly pointed to this as a sort of question of influencing behavior. I love this spectrum of conversation from, kind of, it's up to, not that you're fully saying this, but a little bit of a laissez-faire. It's up to the students to behave as they wish to behave, recognizing there's risk, all the way to centralized rules and regulations. We're, as you can tell from the conversation about a compact, looking at various ways to try to encourage more healthy behaviors and send the kinds of signals that we've been talking about all along going to be essential to get students to agree to come back and their families to do the same. One additional tool, if that's the right word, is we have been testing across the summer, and I know other institutions as well, some of these, for lack of a better word, and this may head us to your next question, Christina, but surveillance practices where, I'm part of this huge research study that Wake Forest Baptist Hospital's managing. I wake up in the morning, I answer 5 questions on my phone every morning about, do I feel any symptoms? Do I feel this way or that way? Do I have my mask with me, and so on? We're going to enroll all students who are willing in this kind of protocol so that at least when they wake up or start their day, they've got frontal lobe because they've responded to 4 or 5 questions about symptoms and the like. This we think also can be useful. First of all, it can help us trace if they do have symptoms, we can respond medically. But it also, we hope, will have some slight behavioral influence. If you've said, yes, I have my mask with me, you're more likely to have it with you than if you haven't been asked.
Yeah, exactly.
We see that in an employment context oftentimes, where if you're issued a laptop from your employer, you may, when you load it up in the morning, you turn it on, there may be a waiver that says, I understand this is a company laptop, and that none of the information on there belongs to me, and my employer can take a look at everything that's loaded here. Now, at a certain point, that one click through, you don't even read it after the 10th time, but because you're not really required to interact with it. I think what you're talking about is quite clever and smart, because that required interaction and affirmation will get, as you said, frontal lobe. And primacy, recency, all of that, you're being in front of the students on a regular basis, whether it's through a daily survey or some other type of communication, is going to go a long, long way in terms of trying to get compliance. And the more compliance you have, the less incident of disease you're going to have, which means your risk as a university is going to go down, and you've protected your students that much more.
Yeah. Let's pick up on this thread. Robert, you've pointed out that, the more tools of the surveillance state are available, the more, you're going to be surveilled. So the more we go online, the more we're going to be surveilled. So we're talking about one instance, which is, an opt-in, and it's very important to for me as a reminder, I've shoved masks in every pocket and bag and, everywhere else to make sure it's there. It's helpful to have those reminders, but what are some concerns, Robert, that you see as you think about some of the online implications we're going towards?
Well, I think it's going to be important for colleges to avoid the warning, civil libertarian ahead, the temptation that the federal government has fallen into, which is using the tools of surveillance that were intended for one thing, in the case of post 9/11 terrorism prevention, to actually do something else, which is enforce the everyday criminal law against Joe Blow in somewhere in Kentucky or whatever. I think what's going to be an important thing for universities to resist is, with these increased surveillance tools, there's going to be the real temptation to use them for other than public health reasons. And unlike the government, I almost wonder if I think the government can get away with that sort of thing. I think it's going to be tougher. Like, for instance, if you did have a contact tracing, it doesn't sound like this is what Rogan was talking about, but I know, for instance, Apple and Google have this Bluetooth-based contact tracing thing that they're doing, that they actually, it's very anonymized. Colleges obviously wouldn't have it anonymized. They presumably would be able to link an individual student to another one. But if you have accusations that, somebody was at a party drinking, or somebody was engaged in sexual assault or something like that, and you could use that Bluetooth linking data or GPS data or whatever it is for the contact tracing that you're doing in order to track that, you've got a ready-built surveillance state right there. So can universities actually resist using that? both on a moral basis, like if you could use it, is it really right not to? If you could prove that somebody was or was not where they said they were, and that was the thing, would it be moral not to use it? Would you be able to deny that location data to other students? Let's say you have a dispute and you think that you'd like to see the data on some other student who's involved, moral witness, etc. There's a whole Pandora's box that's going to be opened by this. I think the easiest way would be to, if it's possible, to somehow confine this solely to public health, and just say, regardless of the provocation, we are not going to use it for anything else. I think, though, that's going to be extremely difficult to do politically, just because they will say, you have it, you should use it. But if you do that, the compliance is obviously going to drop. I mean, this is the problem. When you have a public health tool, once people realize it's not about that, they're going to quit doing it, because people respond to logical incentives in that area. So that's going to be a whole thorny issue. I mean, I think hopefully this will be as temporary as possible and these tools will go away. But if the federal government is any sign, the tools won't go away. I think that probably won't be a problem with most colleges, but it's something to be concerned about from a civil libertarian perspective.
Well, when they built the toll roads back in the 50s or the 60s, the idea was you'd only have to pay the tolls to pay it back. So, 60 years later, we still have to put the coins in the bin. I agree with you completely about the concern about the collection and use of this data. And I think we could really take a page from the Europeans and the GDPR. Because the Europeans, they require you, if you're going to be collecting data, that you have to have opted in to have that data collected. And I would ask whether or not you think there's a real opt-in, a voluntary opt-in for students who, if they want to get their courses done, are going to have to opt into this online. And they're going to be potentially having robust political conversations in their women's studies class, where that is going to be, and that's going to be captured, and that's going to be available, and you're going to have potentially subject to disclosure or hacking. So, the way you end up making sure that individual data is maintained in a private way and it is secure is that you allow for liability. Real robust liability. If the school really feels that they are at risk for lawsuits because they have lousy data privacy, they're either going to increase their data privacy or they're going to get rid of the data, right? You shouldn't have data that you don't need. If you don't have a use for it, why on earth would you maintain last year's political science discussions in an online course? Why would that be kept and maintained? That ought to go away, because you risk the lively atmosphere of a school and that kind of robust conversation when it's captured and it's potentially subject to disclosure. So it's going to be very, very important for schools to make sure that they get voluntary opt-in for some of that, for those discussions and that type of thing, or at least notification that it is going to be recorded and that they sign an acknowledgement that says, yes, I understand that this is online and my conversation is going to be recorded.
I want to add real quick that there are groups out there that are encouraging, now that things are online, people to record classes, particularly to target professors, on either the left or the right, or for reasons on either the left or the right, to do some sort of political policing of professors. And of course, we've seen a huge explosion of the sort of Twitter hunting of people who said unpolitically correct things, which are gonna, you sort of hope that people will say contrarian things in classes. And so I think there's really no way to avoid having more of that, but I think eliminating, at least making it so that somebody has to take an affirmative step as opposed to dredging something up from last year's poli-sci discussion or something, is a very good idea to have. And same with this contract tracing data. Once it's over, I think there's gonna be a lot of pressure from, scientists will say, we need to study this. That probably needs to be resisted. even though, yes, I understand that it would work, I think there are some things that just are too risky to have around, and lists of people who might have a particular disease is pretty high on the list.
Yeah.
Well,
It strikes me, though, this could kind of go both ways. I mean, I'm generally inclined to say, don't collect a lot of information on me. I don't want you following everything I do. But they're goods on both sides. So if we think about, yes, I don't want everybody to know whether I've had COVID-19, didn't have COVID-19, if I have other ailments. But we can't discount the value of big data to science. There may be good studies someone would want to do of what's the effect of COVID-19 on a thing like a college campus when people are actually there. And then I was thinking, a lot of people, they don't worry about the government as much as maybe I do, but they say, look, I don't want Google to have all my information. They might put out a great contact tracing app, but then they harvest all that data. And I can imagine a lot of students would be like, I'm a little upset because I just put in my information about COVID-19 and suddenly I'm getting all these ads for vitamins or something on my, my Twitter account or something like that. Mm-hmm. There seems like a connection I don't like. So on the flip side, I may not like all those ads, but then again, people push things to me because they have information that might be useful to me. And sometimes I'm like, I didn't know that existed. Mm-hmm. Now I know for somebody in my situation, something's there that can help. So I don't think we should too quickly discount the positives of some things that may seem intrusive, which seems to me the policy that is bedrock importance for any institution is that you be clear about what you're doing. If you think that it's valuable for it to have data available to do scientific research, say, we're going to ask you to fill these surveys out every day and be aware that this will go to the, Wake Forest Hospital or something, where it'll be used for scientific purposes, and we promise data anonymity or something like that. And so what's important is mainly clarity to the students, not necessarily defaulting automatically to less data collection is better.
But you don't want to default to the next step, which is monetizing the data information from the students in a way that then allows some third party to connect to them. You should never be getting ads for VapoRub as a result of the fact that you said yes or no on a survey to your university. I mean, that should never happen.
Yeah, and I think this gets to a good point, even in delivery of content. So, we're sort of talking about, we're moving into things that the school's doing to things that we're bringing in third-party vendors to do, to things that have maybe some hybrid relationship between the school and the vendors. And, even as someone who would teach online, there probably are parts of the online class that should not be recorded or should not be. So it's really complicated to think through what are the places in particular content delivery that make sense to use one technology versus another, or to record something versus not record it. But definitely to this point of third-party vendors, the scenario for evaluating these relationships and who's collecting data and what they're collecting and what they can do with it is quite complicated, and many of us would never use a Google tracing app. So, it's like I would use Wake Forest before I would use Google, right? But Peggy, what are your thoughts there? You're seeing a lot of those relationships. I mean, you've dealt with a lot of the fallout from those relationships. Right?
You mean on the third party, giving data to third parties? Yeah. Well, a lot of this, there's a hierarchy of need here when you're looking at data, right? So how public is the data? Then you build privacy and data security policies and procedures around that data, depending upon what that data is and how personally sensitive it is. Okay, so you may look at somebody's address, and that's going to be far less sensitive than, say, somebody's grade point average and so forth. So you have to develop individual policies and technical capability around the data relating to how sensitive it is. And that includes your third-party data vendors or any third parties. You know, there's this idea of business associates in HIPAA, where they have to prove up to you that they have the same data security that you have. Your responsibilities don't go away because you've now given the data to some third party. Whatever third party you're dealing with has to have as robust a plan for data security that you do. And yours should be built, your data security and data privacy should be built in a thoughtful, tiered way, depending upon what the data is. And the problem you have in schools and universities is that you have all these teachers who are out there who, you know, don't necessarily feel that they have to step in line with the university policy. Okay. You know, if you ever seen a bag of cats before, I used to think when I was in a law firm that, you know, the worst bag of cats you'd ever see was a bunch of law firm partners, and it's not, it's professors. So trying to get them to step in line with regard to that data security, data privacy is really tough. We talked last week about the story I had where there's a third party source that will check students' homework for plagiarism, called Turnitin. And so you're supposed to upload your homework, and then that is going to run it against the entire internet and all words ever written in life. And then they're going to send back a report to your teacher about whether or not you've plagiarized your homework. And schools, my kids' schools were using it, and they weren't anonymizing it. They were requiring my kids to put their name in it and their student ID when they turned it up. So there's some vast database up there that's got my 8th grade son's homework, which is terrible. I mean, you really, and when I pointed that out to the administrators, there was a long pause, and then they got back to me a month and a half later with a letter from their lawyers. So, you know, you need to make sure that you are anonymizing aggregated data as much as you possibly can. You're right. There's all kinds of good information that can come from this that is going to help the university community, the contact tracing, et cetera. But, you know, all of that data should be encrypted and anonymized, and it should be not kept in any kind of format that would allow anyone, whether you get hacked or not, to trace that individual healthcare data, to trace any kind of other data back to the individual student. The minute you anonymize data, you've really protected everybody. But if you have teachers who are just ad hoc making decisions about what third-party platform they're going to be using and how, they're going to undermine all of that.
That's a good point. Anybody else want to weigh in?
I'll just affirm the vital importance of building into any third-party relationship all the data controls possible. We really make a policy of not releasing data or enabling the third parties we work with in various places, often in information systems, for example. The data stays ours, and I think much of the more libertarian end of the spectrum comments we've heard, I think those are pretty well satisfied. We're super careful about this. And honestly, I mean, the question is, we begin with is, can we do our own work on this? I mean, in the crisis arising back in early March, lots of questions about how do we try to figure out where our students are and where they're sheltering in place, that is, and that we all have the ones who are overseas because it was spring break back home. There are vendors who offered a kind of quick survey for us, but then they'd know. And so we rejected that and did our own work. Obviously, in a world where universities are, and you can tell from this conversation, we are the most complex kinds of institutions that humans have created. We have so many different pieces and parts and aspects, and as Peggy says, complex faculty members, as well as 18 to 22-year-olds and older, and so on. We need assistance for some of these details, but where we can build it ourselves, especially when it comes to student-related data, we are building it ourselves.
Yeah.
Well, a quick vendor comment is just, and this, it's just worth remembering that when you do agree with the vendor, you're importing their their policies into your own as well. This hit us hard. We learned at Fire that many universities use, for instance, they have a Facebook page and they use Facebook's tools that can censor various words. So you can block various words. And some universities were using them for political purposes. There was one that had PETA protesters, and they were blocking any mention of animal cruelty and that sort of thing. But that's universities setting themselves. But the interesting thing was Facebook itself has a list of profanity. You can turn on their profanity filter, but it's a secret list. You don't know what's on the list. So if you're Wake Forest or if you're UNC Chapel Hill, you turn this thing on, you've just authorized effectively a private company to do the regulation for you. For a private university, that might not be that big a deal. For a public university, it raises questions of whether or not you've effectively deputized them as part of a government agency. And, because we don't know what's on Facebook's list. What if they're engaged in political censorship or something else? Facebook is not, I only bring it up, not because it's, necessarily going to play a part here, although it may with talking about COVID or remedies and things like that. But because there's a lot of pitfalls that can fall in there. And particularly, I think it's riskier for public universities, but even for private universities who might not realize quite, all they do is click a button. They might not really realize what all is going behind that button. And yeah, it's complicated. I have much sympathy for them.
Yeah, so that brings us a little bit to the next point we wanted to discuss. What happens when civil protests come to college campus in the fall? What can we do? This is a very difficult balance of supporting free speech and maintaining safety. So how can we do this effectively so we can, encourage people to have a voice and make sure they're safe at the same time? Who'd like to start?
I think there are probably, people have sort of come up with safe protesting guidelines. Obviously, the safest guideline is don't get in a big group with people. That said, we've obviously seen that, the social distancing break down, in the current protests. So I think there are going to be, particularly on some campuses, they're going to have that issue. But, I think it's not all COVID related, though. It's also related to, George Floyd and the things that, the defund the police movement and it's Black Lives Matter, et cetera. And universities, I think, would be, because they don't have enough to do right now, would be smart to talk to some of the other universities out there who've already had this experience. I bet Berkeley has lots of thoughts on it. They don't always handle it best, but talk to other universities who've had to deal with these issues. They come up periodically, and I think there's a lot that can be done in terms of having agreements with law enforcement about how they're going to aid and that sort of thing. But I think it would also behoove universities to financially try to put some money aside for this, maybe to self-insure or even develop some sort of risk pool. These things are going to periodically happen just because we live in a democracy and there's going to be protests. And universities, particularly some of them come to Fire and said, hey, we can't afford to have these people come and talk because, we care about free speech, but it's going to be $200,000 in security. And there needs to be some way to make sure to sort of plan ahead for that and smooth it out for universities. I think they'd be wise to start. Obviously, it's too late to do that now, but it's not too late for the next time. And there's always a next time.
Mm-hmm. Rogan, you had a very adorable Zoom bomber there. What?
Sorry.
What are your thoughts?
Well, I've been Zooming here. My little 7-year-old is making in a Zoom cooking class.
Oh, that's nice.
Made a smoothie. Sorry for that, but so yes, Robert's accurately noted that across campuses, and especially in recent years, it has. In my experience in higher ed, there's the most of civil protests of one sort or another in recent years than in probably since the 60s, and certainly in this George Floyd honoring era we're in, there will be more. And it's not just a fall question, Christina. There's a number of campuses have seen protests in recent weeks. Clemson had one, for example, over the weekend. There's a group of students who have just brought Wake Forest a petition about holding one in coming weeks. I'd say in general that to remain in close conversation with, these are generally student organized and driven. Sometimes it's students working with community members, sometimes faculty of your institution as well, but stay in conversation with them to ensure that, and especially in this COVID era where Robert began, that there are healthier and more and safer ways to have protests. First of all, make sure they're outdoors if at all possible. Most of them are, of course, but there's been petitions to have them inside at some institutions, I know. And then work with the organizers to make sure people are separated, that there's various kinds of social distancing take place, that we're in North Carolina is moving into was moving towards new phases where we allowed larger gatherings. The recent uptick in COVID cases has put that in a state of suspense. But I'd say generally that along with these voice expressive moments, it's really important to work with students in particular, faculty and staff colleagues, to make sure that you're also taking action. Universities have been issuing statements in the wake of George Floyd's tragic killing. There also, the protesters and others make clear there also needs to be significant actions taken. And I'd add one more piece that I think is really significant for universities or educational institutions. And going back a few years with our Wake Forest student, again, particularly groups who are looking to really make a mark and express their outrage and displeasure and sense of marginalization and the like, we work with them, talk to them directly and say, you want to be a better social justice warrior. You want to change the world in significant ways. You want to, as I say, make your mark around this particular issue or set of issues. We have an educational institution that can help you get better at that. So here's the arrangement, or here's the compact, so to speak. Engage in this set of workshops. We have a Vincent Harding social justice seminar that runs for 2 weeks, for example. Sign up for the Harding seminar. Have a combination of our faculty, community members, organizers, and the like work with you on how to become a more effective change maker, issue advancer, mark maker, social justice warrior, and the like. Become better at that. And if you'll do that, if you'll engage in this educational practice that an educational institution helps run, and you decide in the wake of that educational experience that this is the place, Wake Forest is this institution, is where you want to make your mark, we welcome that. What we've found is that you get a genuine, interesting, engaged dialogue that takes place, as opposed to, we hold you to account, evil administration, for all these terrible wrongs, and evil faculty or evil whomever. It's been a really, I think, valuable iterative process that's resulted in, the point is not to halt protest or say everything's fine, but it is to engage and partner and work with students and faculty and, again, staff who are aggrieved or want to make a mark and so on in ways that I think are ultimately fruitful.
Neal?
I think that's a great idea. You're an educational institution, help them and guide them, because sometimes we forget that colleges are where kind of the adults are, people with experience, people with a lot of learning, and they're there to help guide people without that. As far as COVID-19 is concerned, it strikes me that if somebody's going to engage in a protest, that's something they're choosing to do themselves. So I don't know that it's the job of a university to say, you can't protest unless you have a mask on. Again, you're dealing with adults, and it seems that if an adult wants to do that, as we're seeing in protests all around the country, that is largely on them to do it. I have more of a question now, because I'm not actually able to answer this, but I've been thinking about this. Cato does a lot of work on qualified immunity issues. I am not a lawyer, but it strikes me that many private colleges have sort of a private sort of security force or department. Public colleges have more of an actual police department. I don't know, there may be ramifications for how a private college's security department can intervene versus police, especially if things start to go from protest to property destruction or violence.
Well, I think one thing that's important to understand is if you're aware that an activity is going to take place or is likely to take place on your private property, you need to plan for it. And you need to do the things that you can do in order to make it as least damaging to the community as possible. Whether you have, if you build a pool, the regulations tell you have to put a fence around it, right? Mm-hmm. Even though anybody that would drown in it is trespassing, right? So I think Rogan was making great points about working with the community. The school should really think about giving a welcome back to campus bag with some hand sanitizer and maybe a list that says, hey, here are a list of links that you can look at if you're going to engage in protests. Here's some safe guidelines. So third parties, take a look at it. We support free speech, but we want this community to be healthy. Here's a couple of masks. And whether or not it's a protest related, right? Because if you want people to be wearing masks, give them a couple of masks. They're paying $40,000 a semester anyway, or what have you. So even though it's a very tough time financially, these are sort of smart things to do to help with compliance. And you want to be their partner. I don't know of any protester that wants to be a super spreader, that wants to get sick, or that wants to make other people sick. That's not their goal at all. And you'll see that many of them are trying their best to try and have a safe protest with the masks, et cetera. Mm-hmm. Not everybody, obviously, but I think it's important to be a partner in that, because you are going to see that in that community. If you look at the protesters, it skews extremely young, as it always does. Those are people that are willing to take risks to fight for beliefs, things that they believe in. And that's the whole point of being in college, is to learn and to talk about civil unrest, to talk about political issues.
Mm-hmm. That's a great point. We need to start to wrap up, but I would like to ask everyone to share with me what you've been thinking could be a potentially positive outcome from this, economic crisis, and all the tangential things that, have come from it. So, Robert, let me start with you. What's something that you'd like to see come out of this that could be a positive change for good?
Well, I think that there is a potential to, because there are so many things happening at one time, for to bring these issues to the fore and make it clear. For instance, if you're not Berkeley, maybe you don't have a really good protest plan. Well, maybe now you need to. Maybe there's going to be another pandemic 5 years from now, or even next week. I saw a news headline that they'd found another coronavirus in some wet market in China. I mean, are we going to be doing all this again for another one? I mean, who knows? So I think having that preparedness is going to be valuable for universities. I think also, even though I'm personally a little bit dubious about the value of online learning, given my kids' school, I have 11 and 9-year-old. They did about as good a job as anybody could, but it's just not the same as being in school. We've run sort of a natural experiment, and given the cost and sort of the burden that college costs can be on people now, if somebody has found an effective way to deliver it and that were to spread, I think that could make a huge difference in terms of college accessibility and affordability, and help colleges not have to build the kind of capital improvements that they're always having to do too. I mean, maybe you don't need a bigger campus. Maybe you can do with fewer, this, that, or the other thing. I think everybody could potentially benefit. Workplaces, I mean, fire has worked pretty well online. We're not a college, but there've got to be things that we can find. And I'm hoping that COVID will help push that forward a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Neal, let me ask you.
Yeah, well, I mean, Robert said some of the things I was going to say. I'm not sure that online has worked as badly as some people think. I don't think it's worked as well as some of the glowing things I've seen. This sort of expands from kindergarten through higher education. You're going to get a different experience at all different age levels. What we've seen at K through 12 is there are actually some kids who seem to enjoy it a lot more. Most kids would rather be back in school. So maybe there's a sort of win-win here. I do think that it's given people broadly a belief that you can have more flexibility in education than they used to think you could have. Most people thought, I must go to a place if I want to get a physical place, if I want to get a good education. And I think they're learning it is possible to get access to lots of information to learn things from your home. And that's good, especially if you live in a rural area. You know, you have obligations at your home and you can't travel to a great university somewhere. You might be able to get courses that way. And so that's good. More flexibility is what we should want. The flip side is it's also made a lot of people appreciate actually being with other people for education, the social aspects, the how we learn because we play off of each other. And so, you know, there are kids who say, who you'd think, well, they didn't really like school, as they say, I'd really rather be in school with my friends. And so we get this flexibility, but with a new appreciation by many people for physical school and education together, which is good for sort of existing colleges and universities. And so in that way, it may be kind of a win-win.
Peggy?
Well, you know, with respect to whether or not online education works, you know, there are students that it works quite well with and students that it does not. You know, when you're dealing with students that have disabilities of any kind, you know, the legion of students with ADD, et cetera, or other types of learning disabilities, it's a real bust. And I think the less motivated of student you are, the worse it gets. And I think it's going to be really tough and important to have some kind of guidelines on online so that you can help capture and catch those students that are falling behind or that aren't able to navigate the various apps here, there, et cetera, everywhere. I mean, there's this expectation that all students are created equally in terms of trying to learn in that way and navigate all those various platforms, and it's just not true. And I think it's particularly difficult for really large universities. You know, when you've got 20,000 undergraduates, I mean, how are you going to catch that kid? Or all of those kids. So I think there's an opportunity. I mean, everybody did this on the fly, pivoted to online on the fly in March. And some had some programs in place so that they had a platform that they could go to, and others just had to do it, while they were on fire. And so there was varying levels of success. I think at the very least, what this last couple of months have done, hopefully, if they're communicating with the community, they're communicating, if it's K through 12, they're communicating with parents, they're communicating with students to find out what worked and what didn't, because this really needs to be made better. If we're going to be doing this on the long term, we have to make it better. We have to make it more consistent, and we have to make sure that the types of information that is being gathered is the appropriate type, and that the teaching is actually happening. My son's in high school, and he was given philosophy homework to just read and then answer a question. Can you imagine reading Kant and then being asked to just answer yes or no? I mean, it's a ridiculous way to teach that, and I can't blame the school. They're doing the best they could, right? But right now, you have to do better than that in the fall because you've had enough leeway to get better.
Yeah.
But I think all of this has to do with forging relationships with the community, whether we're talking about protests in the fall or compliance with social distancing in the dorms or having parties or whatever it is. Everything that we've talked about, it really goes back to making sure that you really have open communication and you're getting feedback from the community that you're serving and whose money you're taking in order to provide the best possible education that you can in the safest possible way.
Yeah. Right, Rogan, let me ask you to wrap it up for us. But I do want to make a comment that I noticed what I liked about Wake Forest is that they're thinking they're going forward with building everything both online and in person. And I see that as a really strong strength going forward into the future, because even once we're past this, if you think about the way that people learn, and maybe they'll be in class for a couple of weeks and want to do an internship and come back, or maybe they, need to go home, but having that flexibility to be there and maybe not be there because of other life concerns is, I don't know, is that like an innovation in higher ed? That must be, there's a lot of resources and time invested in doing that, having that flex model, but it's something that I see is potentially a great outcome. But Rogan, let me have you wrap us up here.
Sure, and I actually have a different positive hope for emergence outcome of this horrible crisis and pandemic. I hope that we all come out with a renewed appreciation for liberal arts education in whatever modality, online, blended, face-to-face, et cetera. A question I ask almost every group I'm in front of, students, parents, alumni, community members and the like, is which discipline, which scholarly discipline, we love our disciplines and our silos, which discipline is giving us the best guidance for responding to the COVID crisis? And immediately the answers come back multiple. In fact, I've been keeping track on this call of the different disciplines that we all have mentioned, along with our natural homopolitical science, public health, law, sociology, organizational management, behavioral economics, religion, anthropology, communications, including, I suppose, English, and the arts. That's before we get into infectious disease, virology, and the like. Look, the liberal arts have taken a real hit in recent years from right and left. They're either, snowflake, useless, can't get you a career, or hopelessly patriarchal and racist and all the rest of the sins. At the same time, a broad-based, multidisciplinary education that you get from liberal arts, including in professional schools like business, law, divinity at Wake Forest. There's a real commitment to this broad-based learning. There is no substitute. And this crisis, terrible as it is, has been a useful reminder that we need one another across disciplines to come to any hope for a solution.
Thank you, Rogan. This has been a great discussion. I appreciate everyone's time. We are now 2 minutes past our allotted hour, and I'm sure we could keep going for another hour if we all had the time. But thank you everyone for joining us, and thank you everyone in the audience for joining us. This video will be available on YouTube, and please join us for our next panel discussion, which will be in early July, and we will post information about that as well on our website. So thank you everyone, and have a great afternoon. Bye.